The wind howling through the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana carries a specific kind of promise in late October. Winter is coming and it will be merciless. For Margaret Brennan kneeling on the dusty floor of a limestone cave, she can barely see in the failing moonlight. Survival has become a mathematical equation, with 11 wooden matches as the only variable between warmth and death. Her fingers, already numb despite the rabbit furs she salvaged from a snare 2 days prior, carefully separate each stick from the damp cardboard box. 11, not 12. She counts again, her breath fogging in the frigid air. 11 strikes between her and the frozen corpse they will find come spring. 3 weeks ago, on a morning when frost turned the cabin windows into sheets of opaque glass, Margaret woke not to the sound of Thomas stirring the coals in the cook stove, but to silence. That should have been the first warning. Her husband never slept past dawn, not in 6 years of marriage, not even when fever laid him low, during the brutal winter of '76. She pulled on her wool socks and stepped onto the cold plank floor, calling his name into the stillness. No answer came from the main room. No answer came from the porch where he sometimes sat to watch the sun crest over the ridgeline. She found his body at the old timber site 2 miles from their cabin, pinned beneath a massive ponderosa pine that had no earthly reason to fall on a windless morning. The men of Salvation Ridge carried Thomas home on a makeshift litter of saplings and canvas, their faces grave, their eyes avoiding hers. Reverend Silas Hackett walked at the front of the procession, his pale hands folded across his chest, his lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been something else entirely. When they laid Thomas on the rough-hewn table in the cabin, Margaret pushed past them all and examined her husband's body with the clinical detachment she had learned in a field hospital tent outside Da Nang. The bruising around his throat came in the distinct pattern of fingers. The angle of the tree's impact had crushed his ribs, yes, but those purple marks on his neck told a different story. She voiced none of this, not to Silas, not to Wade Collier, the Reverend's enforcer, who stood in the doorway with his hand resting on the butt of a revolver that had no place in a community supposedly founded on peace. Margaret had been a trauma nurse for 14 months in a war zone where speaking the wrong truth at the wrong time got people disappeared. She knew when to stay silent. So she washed Thomas's body herself, dressed him in his Sunday clothes, and buried him in the small cemetery at the edge of the settlement, while Silas intoned verses about God's mysterious ways in the faithful departed. Sarah Mitchell, Margaret's closest friend in Salvation Ridge, stood beside her during the service, but when Margaret reached for her hand, Sarah pulled away as if scalded. The fracture had already begun. 21 days after they put Thomas in the ground, Margaret woke to the sound of boots on her porch. Heavy boots, multiple pairs. The sky outside was still the deep purple of pre-dawn, and through the window she could see her breath crystallizing in the lamplight. She pulled on her robe and opened the door to find Reverend Silas Hackett, flanked by 3 men. Wade Collier, his hand predictably near his weapon. David Harrison, the young blacksmith, who had always seemed kind until this moment. And John Mitchell, Sarah's husband, who at least had the decency to look ashamed. Silas did not waste time on pleasantries. His voice, flat and administrative, carried the weight of a pronouncement already decided. Thomas Brennan died owing a considerable debt to this community. He borrowed seed from our common stores. He used tools maintained by collective labor. He benefited from the labor of others in raising his cabin and clearing his land. With his passing, a widow cannot contribute an equal share to Salvation Ridge. The council has voted, by Article 14 of our charter, this cabin and all stores within it are forfeit to the community. You have 1 hour to collect what you can carry on your back. Then you leave. Margaret felt the words land like physical blows. 1 hour? Leave. The nearest town, Missoula, lay 40 miles through predator-filled wilderness and mountain passes that would be impassable within 2 weeks once the heavy snows arrived. To be cast out now was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic precision. Thomas built this house with his own hands. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He paid for the seed with money we saved before we ever came to this place. "We owe you nothing, Silas. Winter is coming. You cannot do this." Wade Collier stepped forward, shoving a rolled piece of parchment against her chest hard enough to make her stumble backward. "The council voted. Article 14 is clear. You got 1 hour, Margaret. Pack light." She looked past Silas, searching the gathering crowd of settlers for a friendly face, for anyone who might speak up. Sarah stood near the back, her arms wrapped tight around her middle, her eyes fixed on the mud. Margaret had nursed that woman through pneumonia last winter, sitting up for 3 nights straight to keep her fever from spiking into delirium. Now Sarah would not even meet her gaze. The silence from the assembled community roared louder than any condemnation. They were complicit in her murder, and they all knew it. The hour passed like a fever dream. Wade stood in her doorway, rifle cradled in his arms, watching her every movement. When she reached for the heavy wool coat Thomas had given her, their first winter together, Wade shook his head. "Community property, leave it." The Winchester rifle above the mantel, the one Thomas had taught her to shoot when coyotes threatened their chickens, that too was forbidden. "Can't have you coming bad armed and hostile." Wade said, something almost like pleasure in his voice. In the end, she was permitted a single wool blanket, the clothes on her back, a canvas rucksack containing 2 days' worth of dried venison, and hardtack, a hunting knife with a 4-inch blade, and a small tin box containing flint steel and a handful of char cloth for starting fires. No winter coat, no rifle, no axe. The medical supplies she had brought with her from her army days, the surgical kit and antibiotics she had hoarded, in case of emergency, all of it confiscated as community resources. Wade and David marched her the 2 miles to the property boundary marked by a rusted barbed wire fence, sagging between rotted posts. Beyond it stretched thousands of acres of raw Montana wilderness, the mountains rising in serrated ridges against a sky already heavy with the promise of snow. Wade rested his hand on his sidearm, his smile thin and cruel. "Don't come back, Margaret. You cross this fence again, you will be treated as a hostile trespasser. May God watch over your soul." They turned their backs and walked away, their laughter carrying on the wind until distance swallowed it. Margaret stood alone as the temperature dropped, with the fading light, watching the first flurries begin to drift down from slate-gray clouds. She could have sat down right there, could have let the cold take her quickly, a mercy compared to what would come if she tried to fight. But as she stood at that fence line, something hardened in her chest, a core of white-hot fury that burned hotter than any fire. Silas Hackett had not evicted her because she was a burden. He wanted her land. He wanted her gone. And she refused to give him the satisfaction of finding her frozen corpse. Margaret turned her back on Salvation Ridge and stepped into the dense pine forest. The terrain rose sharply, and within a quarter-mile her calves burned with the effort of climbing. She had no plan beyond a memory, a slender thread of hope tied to something Thomas had shown her during the summer of '77. They had been tracking a wounded buck that Thomas insisted would spoil Ohio if they did not find it before nightfall. The pursuit had taken them far beyond the settlement's boundaries into country none of the other settlers bothered to explore. Thomas had stopped at the base of a limestone cliff, which pulled aside a curtain of ancient ivy and revealed a narrow opening in the rock. The natives called it the mouth of the earth, he had whispered, his voice full of boyish excitement. Nobody in Salvation Ridge knows it's here. The cave had been a curiosity, then a secret place they explored by lamplight, marveling at the high ceiling and the natural chimney that wound up through the rock to vent somewhere on the surface above. Whispering Hollow Thomas had named it because of the way the wind sang through the stone when conditions were right. Margaret had laughed at the time, never imagining she would stake her life on finding it again. But find it she must. The cave lay somewhere to the northeast, perhaps 5 miles from where she now stood, up treacherous slopes and through dense forest she would have to navigate in failing light. If her memory failed her, if the cave had collapsed, if she simply froze to death before reaching it, that would be the end. No one would know. No one would care. She walked, one foot in front of the other, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the altitude and exertion combined to steal the air from her lungs. The temperature plummeted as the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks and the snowflakes grew larger, wetter, sticking to her hair and shoulders. Every snapping branch sounded like a grizzly bear. Every distant howl threatened to shatter her nerve. Her feet, clad only in leather boots meant for cabin life rather than wilderness survival, felt like blocks of ice. But she kept moving, driven by pure spite, by the memory of Sarah Mitchell's averted eyes, by the image of Silas Hackett's cold calculation as he condemned her to death. Just past midnight, when exhaustion had reduced her vision to a tunnel and her hands had gone past pain into numbness, Margaret recognized the jagged profile of the limestone cliff. The moon, emerging briefly from behind the clouds, illuminated the rock face in stark relief. She scrambled up a scree slope on hands and knees, tearing her fingernails, feeling blood stick her palms to the frozen stones. The ivy curtain hung dead and brittle with the season's frost, and for a terrible moment she thought the entrance had been sealed by rockfall. But when she pushed through the tangled vines, the narrow gap remained, and she squeezed through into the blessed relief of stillness. The cave welcomed her with dry air and the absence of wind. Margaret collapsed onto the dusty floor and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of shaking, violent gratitude before forcing her mind back to the work of survival. She was out of the elements. That was step one. But the cave, for all its shelter, was essentially a stone refrigerator. The ambient temperature inside hovered perhaps 10 degrees warmer than outside, enough to prevent immediate death, but nowhere near enough to sustain life through a Montana winter that could drop to 30 below zero. She needed fire. She needed it now. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled the char cloth from the tin box. The flint and steel felt foreign in her grip, and it took 6 attempts before a spark caught and the cloth began to smolder. She fed it carefully with shredded bark from the inside of her rucksack, then added the smallest twigs she could find in the cave's entrance, debris blown in by wind over the years. The flames guttered and nearly died twice before finally taking hold, a tiny beacon of warmth that seemed almost insulting in its insignificance against the vast cold pressing in from all directions. By the fire's meager light, Margaret inventoried her situation with brutal honesty. 2 days of food, perhaps 3 if she rationed severely. A knife, 11 matches as backup if the fire went out and she could not restart it with flint and steel. 1 blanket, the clothes on her back, 0 weapons beyond the blade. And winter arriving not in weeks but in hours, the snow already falling with purpose outside. She had reset the clock. She had bought herself a night, perhaps 2, but survival was a debt that came due every single day, and she had no idea how she would pay it. Margaret did not sleep that first night. She fed the fire with obsessive care, rationing the small amount of combustible material she had gathered, knowing that come dawn she would need to begin the work that would define whether she lived or died. As the flames flickered and the shadows danced on the cave walls, her mind replayed the past 3 weeks with the clarity that comes from exhaustion and shock. Thomas's death, the coldness in Silas's eyes, Wade's barely concealed satisfaction, the community's silence. And beneath it all, a question that had been growing since she first saw the bruises on Thomas's throat. Why kill a good man over a piece of land? Why go to such lengths to ensure his widow died in the wilderness? The answer, Margaret suspected, lay somewhere in the settling's boundaries, in whatever Thomas had been doing during those long days he spent surveying the ridges and valleys, his geological notebooks tucked under his arm. He had been searching for something. She had never pressed him on it, trusting that he would share when ready. Now he was dead and she was alone, and the truth had died with him. Unless it had not. The thought arrived with the force of revelation. Thomas had known something dangerous, had discovered something valuable enough to kill for. And if that were true, he would have hidden evidence, would have prepared for the possibility that Silas Hackett's greed might catch up to him. Thomas had been many things, but careless was not among them. He had shown her this cave, had made sure she knew where to find it, had spoken those words about no one else knowing. That had not been idle talk. That had been instruction. Margaret stood and began to search the cave by firelight, running her hands along the walls, examining every shadow and crevice. The chamber stretched back perhaps 40 feet before narrowing into a passage too tight for a person to navigate. The ceiling rose to 15 feet at its highest point, tapering down to just over 6 feet near the entrance. The natural chimney, a crack in the stone that angled up and away, showed as a darker shadow against the rock. Everything seemed natural, untouched by human hands. She was about to give up when her fingers caught on something that felt wrong. A mark on the wall near the back of the cave about chest height. She brought the fire closer, shielding it with her body, and saw what Thomas had left for her, a symbol scratched into the limestone with deliberate care. The letter T, and below it an arrow pointing down. Margaret's heart began to hammer. She knelt and began scraping at the compacted dirt of the cave floor with her knife, following the arrow's direction. 6 inches down, the blade struck something that rang with a metallic sound entirely foreign to earth and stone. She dug faster, heedless of her torn fingernails, until she had exposed the edges of an olive-drab military ammunition box sealed with wax that had hardened into a protective shell. The tin resisted her efforts to pry it open, but the knife was good steel, and her desperation lent strength. The wax cracked, the seal broke. The lid came free with a screech of protest that echoed through the cave like a scream. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, lay the pieces of a puzzle Margaret had not known she needed to solve. A heavy winter hunting coat canvas in wool large enough to have been Thomas's but serviceable for her if she cinched the belt. A compact sharpening stone. 3 boxes of strike, anywhere matches each containing 50 sticks. 2 cans of preserved peaches, their labels faded but intact. And at the bottom, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, a leather-bound journal. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with Thomas's precise handwriting, page after page of geological surveys, hand-drawn topographical maps, chemical assay results for soil and rock samples. Her husband had not just been logging timber or hunting game during his long absences from the cabin. He had been prospecting, methodically, professionally. The notes dated back almost a year, beginning not long after they had first arrived at Salvation Ridge. She turned pages, scanning entries until she reached the final few weeks of Thomas's life. The handwriting grew less precise, more urgent. The entries shorter, more cryptic. And then on the last page, dated 2 days before his death, found it. The mother lode. Silver vein running through the North Ridge, minimum 8 feet thick assay shows 97% purity. Commercial value substantial. Silas knows. Caught me taking core samples 3 days ago. He demanded I show him the site. I refused. He smiled. Told me the land belongs to God and God's servants, meaning himself. Said we should discuss a fair arrangement. Asked me to meet him at the old timber mill tomorrow morning to work out terms. I see the greed in his eyes. It is not negotiation he wants. Margaret, if you are reading this, I did not come back. It was not an accident. Do not trust Silas Hackett. Do not trust the council. The vein's coordinates are in the map on page 32. The assay samples are buried beneath a loose stone near the cave's east wall. Take them, flee to Missoula, file a claim with the county office. The land is ours by homestead, right. Do not let him steal this, and if you cannot run, then fight. I love you. Forgive me for not being more careful. Thomas. Margaret read the words 3 times each pass, driving the truth deeper into her chest like a blade. Thomas had not died in a logging accident. Silas Hackett had murdered her husband for silver. And then, to cover his crime and secure the mineral rights, Silas had evicted the widow under the pretense of community charter, sending her into the wilderness to die of exposure, ensuring the secret died with her. The grief that Margaret had held at bay through 3 weeks of numbness and shock finally broke through the dam. She wept, her body shaking with sobs that echoed in the stone chamber, the journal clutched against her chest. She cried for Thomas, for the life they had built, for the future they would never have. She cried for her own stupidity in not pushing harder when she saw those bruises and not demanding answers, in trusting that a community founded on faith would behave with integrity. But the tears did not last long. Grief in the wilderness was a luxury she could not afford. The tears dried, evaporated by a heat that had nothing to do with the small fire. Rage replaced sorrow, a furnace of fury that burned away everything soft and left only the core of who Margaret Brennan had been before Salvation Ridge, before marriage, before she had tried to become someone gentle. She had been a combat nurse. She had held dying men while mortars fell. She had learned to survive in a place where survival was not guaranteed, and she would be damned if she let Silas Hackett win. Margaret put on Thomas's coat. It swallowed her frame, but the warmth was immediate and glorious. She carefully stored the journal, the matches, and the peaches in her rucksack. Then she stood and looked at the cave with new eyes. This was not a temporary shelter. This would be her fortress, her base of operations, the place from which she would launch her return. But first, she had to survive winter. Dawn arrived with brutal clarity. The snowfall had stopped, leaving 4 inches of fresh powder coating the world outside the cave. The temperature, already bitter at midnight, had plummeted further. Margaret's breath formed clouds so thick they obscured her vision. She knew with the certainty of someone who had grown up in these mountains before the war, before nursing school, before any of the choices that had led her to this moment, that she had perhaps 48 hours before the next storm system arrived. And when it did, it would not be a dusting. It would be the first real blizzard of the season, the kind that buried cabins and killed livestock and left snowdrifts 15 feet high. She had 2 days to gather enough firewood to survive 3 months of winter. The impossibility of the task should have broken her. A single woman already weakened by 3 weeks of grief and minimal food gathering, enough fuel to last until spring madness. But Margaret had learned in Vietnam that impossible tasks became possible when you broke them into small, achievable steps. She did not need to gather 3 months of wood today. She needed to gather today's wood today. Tomorrow she would gather tomorrow's wood. The progression would either be sufficient or it would not, but paralysis helped no one. She spent the first hour of daylight scouting in an expanding radius from the cave, identifying every piece of deadfall within a half-mile. Pine mostly, with some fir and the occasional oak or maple in the lower elevations. The pine would burn fast and hot. The hardwoods would burn slow and long. She needed both. The problem was volume. A single woman could carry perhaps 50 pounds of wood at a time over rough terrain. To gather even a fraction of what she needed would require hundreds of trips. Unless she could bring the wood to her rather than hauling it piece by piece, Margaret found the solution in a natural feature of the landscape, a steep ravine that ran from higher elevation down to within 100 yards of the cave entrance. If she could drag or roll large logs to the edge of that ravine, gravity would do most of the work. The logs would tumble down, breaking into more manageable pieces on the rocks at the bottom, and she could carry those pieces the remaining distance. It was still brutal labor, but it multiplied her efficiency by a factor of 5 or more. The work began. She identified a dead oak wedged between 2 boulders about a quarter-mile upslope. The tree had fallen years ago and the trunk had seasoned to perfect dryness. It was far too heavy to carry, but using a longer branch as a lever and her own body weight, she managed to shift it free. The oak rolled slowly at first, then gaining momentum as the slope increased. It crashed into the ravine with a sound like thunder shattering into a dozen sections. Margaret climbed down, breathing hard, and began hauling the pieces back to the cave. Each section weighed 30 to 40 pounds. She could manage 2 trips before exhaustion forced her to rest. While she rested, she sharpened her knife on the stone Thomas had left, maintaining the edge she would need for the next task, and the next, and the next. By noon, she had moved half a cord of wood. Her shoulders screamed. Her back felt like it had been beaten with a hammer. But the pile outside the cave entrance was growing. She forced down half her remaining venison and a handful of snow for water, then went back to work. The afternoon brought a discovery that shifted the calculus of her survival. While searching for another suitable log, Margaret stumbled across the partially frozen carcass of a young mule deer, likely killed by a cougar, and then abandoned when the cat was driven off by wolves. The meat was mostly intact. It represented perhaps 80 pounds of protein, a fortune in her current circumstances. She field-dressed the carcass with her knife, working quickly before the scent attracted predators, and hauled the quarters back to the cave in 2 trips. That night, for the first time since her eviction, Margaret ate until her stomach felt full. She roasted venison over the fire, the fat dripping and sizzling, the smell almost unbearably good after days of near starvation. The meat would freeze solid in the cave's natural cold storage, preserving it for weeks. Combined with careful rationing, she might have enough protein to maintain her strength through the worst of winter. The second day followed the same pattern. Identify wood, lever it free, send it down the ravine, haul it to the cave. Her body adapted with the stubbornness that comes from having no choice. Muscles that had grown soft during her time at Salvation Ridge remembered their military conditioning. The work became rhythm. Rhythm became meditation. And through it all, the pile of wood grew. On the evening of the second day, as the wind shifted and the temperature began to drop in the way that presaged a major storm, Margaret stood back and assessed her stockpile. She had gathered approximately 2.5 cords of mixed hardwood and softwood, enough for perhaps 6 weeks of continuous fire if she burned carefully. Not enough, not nearly enough, but it was a foundation. She also had, through a stroke of fortune, she barely believed discovered a rusted axe head wedged deep in a crevice of the limestone likely left by Native Americans or early trappers. Decades ago, the handle had rotted away to nothing but the steel, though pitted with age, still held an edge. She spent 3 hours fashioning a new handle from green oak, splitting the wood with her knife, and binding the head in place with strips of leather cut from her own belt. The result was crude but functional. With an axe, her efficiency would triple. The blizzard arrived on the third night with a roar that shook the mountain. Margaret huddled in the cave, the entrance now partially sealed with a wall of stacked logs that served both as a windbreak and as ready fuel. The thermal mass heater she had constructed, a crude assembly of flat river stones arranged around the fire pit, absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back through the long nights. The temperature inside the cave remained just above freezing cold enough to see breath, but warm enough to sustain life. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. Snow accumulated in staggering volumes outside. The world beyond the cave ceased to exist, reduced to a howling white void. Margaret maintained the fire with obsessive care, feeding it just enough to keep the coals alive, never allowing it to blaze wastefully. She read Thomas's journal cover to cover, memorizing the coordinates of the silver veins, studying the assay reports, understanding exactly what Silas Hackett had killed to possess. The mineral deposit Thomas had discovered was worth millions, not thousands. Millions. Enough to transform Salvation Ridge from a struggling commune into a commercial mining operation. Enough to make Silas Hackett a wealthy man. And Thomas, with his homestead claim filed properly with the county 3 years prior, had held legal title to the land and everything beneath it. Silas could not simply take it. He needed Thomas dead and the widow silenced. Margaret traced the maps with her finger, noting how the vein ran directly beneath the northern boundary of what had been her and Thomas's homestead claim. She noted, too, the dates of meetings Thomas had documented, late-night conversations between Silas and men from Helena, representatives of mining concerns who had clearly been shown samples and made offers. Silas had been planning this for months, perhaps longer, waiting for the right moment to eliminate the obstacle. The blizzard passed on the fourth day, leaving behind a landscape transformed into an alien world of white. Snowdrifts 15 feet high leaned against the cliff face. The entire entrance to her log fortress had been buried, and Margaret spent hours digging a narrow tunnel through the compacted snow to reach open air. When she finally emerged gasping and covered in ice, the sky above was heartbreakingly blue, and the temperature had dropped to what felt like 20 below zero. She had survived the first test, but winter had only begun. The weeks that followed established a brutal routine. Margaret would wake before dawn, feed the fire, eat a small portion of frozen venison and pine needle tea. The tea, bitter and astringent, provided vitamin C to ward off scurvy, a lesson learned from old trappers' accounts. Then she would venture out to check snares she had painstakingly constructed from copper wire salvaged from the frame of her rucksack. Rabbits, when she could catch them, provided protein and fur. She skinned them with growing expertise, tanning the pelts with a mixture of brain matter and smoke, creating a crude fur hat that made the difference between frostbite and survival. Wood gathering continued whenever the weather permitted. By mid-November, Margaret had accumulated 5 cords, nearly doubling her initial stockpile. The physical labor required was monumental. She lost weight rapidly despite the deer meat, her body consuming muscle to fuel the constant exertion. Her reflection in a small piece of polished metal from Thomas's box showed a stranger, gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes, skin burned dark by wind and cold. But she was alive, and every day alive was a victory Silas Hackett had not counted on. The isolation ground at her sanity in ways the physical hardship did not. Days would pass without hearing her own voice. She began talking to Thomas's journal, reading passages aloud, arguing with the pages as if her husband could respond. She spoke to the walls as if they were companions. The line between Margaret Brennan, the widow, and something wilder, something forged entirely by the mountain, began to blur. And through it all, the fury never dimmed. Every frozen morning, every meal of charred rabbit and bark tea every night, when the wind screamed through the chimney hole, she remembered. Sarah Mitchell's averted eyes, Wade Collier's cruel smile, Silas Hackett's cold pronouncement. They had cast her out to die. They believed her dead already, bones freezing in some ravine, problem solved. The thought sustained her when nothing else could. She would return. She would show them what they had created. Margaret Brennan had entered this cave as a grieving widow. She would leave it as something else entirely. December descended on the Bitterroot Mountains not as a month, but as a living entity bent on annihilation. The blizzards that had seemed severe in November intensified into storms that lasted 4 and 5 days without pause, dumping snow in volumes that defied comprehension. 8 feet accumulated in the first 2 weeks, then 10. The temperature plunged to 35 below zero on a night when the sky cleared to reveal stars so bright and cold they seemed to cut the darkness like shards of broken glass. Trees exploded in the freeze, their sap crystallizing and expanding until the trunks burst with cracks that sounded like rifle shots echoing through the canyons. Margaret had prepared as well as any single person could. The fortress of firewood she had constructed at the cave entrance now stood completely buried beneath a drift that rose 20 feet up the cliff face. This proved to be salvation rather than disaster. The massive snowpack created an insulating barrier that sealed Whispering Hollow from the killing wind. She maintained a single narrow tunnel through the compacted snow, barely wide enough to crawl through, accessing the outside world only when absolutely necessary to clear the chimney vent. Most days she remained underground, feeding the fire with wood she had stockpiled inside, existing in a half-lit world of stone and shadow. The deer meat ran out on December 8th. Margaret had rationed it carefully, but there was only so far 80 pounds of protein could stretch when the body burned calories simply staying alive in sub-zero temperatures. She transitioned to whatever her snares produced, supplemented by foraging that grew increasingly desperate. She dug through snow to access rose hips that had frozen on their stems, their tartness a shock against the monotony of charred meat. She located squirrel caches by watching the animals before the worst storms hit, then raided their stores of pine nuts once the deep cold drove the squirrels into hibernation. The guilt of stealing from creatures also fighting to survive lasted exactly as long as her hunger. Pine bark became a staple. She would cut through the outer dead layers to access the cambium, the living layer between bark and wood, scraping it free and boiling it into a paste that provided carbohydrates, if not satisfaction. The taste was resinous and bitter, but it kept the worst of the starvation at bay. Every morning, she boiled pine needles into tea, forcing down the astringent liquid because scurvy killed as surely as freezing and far more painfully. Her body betrayed her in incremental ways. The weight loss that had begun in November accelerated. Her ribs became visible even through Thomas's heavy coat. Her hip bones jutted sharp enough to bruise against the stone floor when she slept. Her period stopped the body's desperate conservation of resources in the face of starvation. But the fire inside her, the rage that had replaced grief, burned hotter than ever. She read Thomas's journal every night by flickering firelight, her frozen fingers turning pages that detailed not just geological surveys, but a love story written in the margins. Small notes Thomas had made observations about Margaret's laugh, about the way sunlight caught her hair, about his hope that they might start a family once they had saved enough to expand the cabin. Those notes should have broken her. Instead, they forged something harder. Silas Hackett had not just killed her husband. He had murdered her future, stolen, and the children she might have had, destroyed a life that had been good and honest and full of simple joy. For silver, for money, for greed wrapped in religious authority. The injustice of it consumed her, and she fed that fire as carefully as she fed the one keeping her alive. The isolation pressed in with physical weight. Weeks passed without human contact, without hearing any voice but her own echoing off the cave walls. She began to have conversations with Thomas, speaking to him as if he sat across the fire arguing with his ghost about the best way to survive, asking his advice about when to venture out for wood, whether to risk checking the snare line in a blizzard or wait for the storm to pass. Sometimes she swore she heard him answer, his voice carried on the wind, singing through the chimney hole. She knew these were hallucinations born of solitude and malnutrition, but she welcomed them anyway. The alternative was a silence so complete it threatened to erase her sense of self entirely. On the morning of December 20th, Margaret woke to find frost had formed inside the cave, despite the fire burning all night. The temperature had dropped beyond anything she had yet experienced. When she crawled through the snow tunnel to check the outside world, the air burned her lungs with each breath. Her spit froze before it hit the ground. This was killing cold, the kind that turned exposed flesh black with frostbite in minutes. She retreated immediately, sealing the tunnel entrance with packed snow, and spent the next 3 days huddled next to the fire, feeding it constantly, watching her stockpile of wood diminish with terrifying speed. The blizzard that accompanied the Arctic cold lasted 96 hours. Margaret burned through half a cord of wood, keeping the fire alive. By the end, she was hallucinating in earnest, seeing shapes move in the shadows, hearing voices that definitely did not belong to Thomas. Once she woke, convinced that Silas Hackett stood at the cave entrance, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight, his mouth moving in silent condemnation. She threw a burning branch at the apparition, and it vanished, revealing nothing but stone and darkness. When the storm finally broke on Christmas Eve, though Margaret had long since lost track of the actual date, she emerged into a world that had been scraped clean of anything resembling life. The snow had drifted into formations that looked like frozen waves, some cresting 25 feet high. The sky stretched overhead in a pale dome of merciless blue. Nothing moved, no birds, no animals, just wind and cold and the vast indifference of the mountain. Margaret stood in that frozen wasteland and understood with absolute clarity that she was going to die if something did not change. Her wood supply, despite all of her labor, would not last until spring, at the rate she was burning it. Her food consisted of whatever she could trap or forage, and the trapping had yielded nothing in 2 weeks because the rabbits had retreated deep into burrows she could not reach. The pine bark and stored nuts would sustain her for perhaps another month, maybe 6 weeks if she pushed starvation to its absolute limit. But spring would not come for 10 weeks minimum. The math was simple and final. She needed protein, real protein, meat with fat and calories dense enough to rebuild her wasting body. And there was only one source of that in the dead of winter: deer. But hunting deer with snares was a fool's hope. She needed a rifle, she needed ammunition, she needed the very things Wade Collier and his ilk had denied her. Margaret stood in the killing cold and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. If men came hunting for her, she would not hide. She would hunt them back. The thought should have horrified her. Margaret Brennan had been a healer, a nurse who had sworn oaths to preserve life. But that woman had died on the day Silas Hackett evicted her into the wilderness. The creature who remained understood survival in simpler terms. If men came to kill her, they forfeited the right to mercy. Their weapons, their supplies, their very lives became resources she could exploit. The moral calculus was brutal but clear. She did not have to wait long. On January 25th, during a brief window of clear weather, Margaret heard the distinctive crunch of snowshoes breaking trail below her position. The sound carried across the frozen landscape with crystalline clarity. She froze, every sense suddenly sharp, the fog of semi-starvation burning away in an instant rush of adrenaline. Someone was out here. Someone was searching, and there was only one reason anyone from Salvation Ridge would be in this region during the worst winter in a decade. Margaret low crawled to the edge of the limestone cliff and peered down through a screen of ice-laden pine branches. Two figures moved along the valley floor approximately 200 yards distant. Even at that range, she recognized Wade Collier's heavy, aggressive gait. The second man was younger, less confident in his movements. David Harrison, the blacksmith. Both carried rifles with scopes, heavy winter packs, and the deliberate focus of men on a mission. She pressed herself flat against the snow and listened. Sound traveled strangely in the frozen air, sometimes carrying clearly, sometimes muffled to nothing by the wind. But when the wind stilled for a moment, Wade's voice reached her position with perfect clarity. Silas said Thomas was out here 3 days before he died. He had to have hidden the assay report somewhere. The widow might have found it. We find her bones, we find the documentation. David's response came quieter, uncertain. It's been 3 months, Wade. Nobody survives this without a cabin. We're chasing a ghost. She's dead and frozen somewhere under 10 feet of snow. Wade's laugh was sharp and ugly. Then we find the ghost's corpse and we find what she was carrying. Spread out. Look for caves, overhangs, anywhere someone might try to hole up. Silas wants proof she's gone before spring thaw brings federal surveyors sniffing around. The words confirmed everything Margaret had suspected and more. Silas was not content with merely evicting her. He needed her provably dead, needed to ensure that no evidence of Thomas's discovery survived to challenge his claim on the land. And he was worried enough to send men into a killing winter to hunt for a woman who should already be a frozen corpse. Margaret's mind raced through options with cold calculation. If Wade and David found Whispering Hollow, if they discovered her alive with Thomas's journal, they would kill her without hesitation. She had no weapon that could match their rifles at range. In a straight fight, she died. But the mountain offered advantages they did not possess. She knew this terrain intimately, now had spent 3 months learning every ridge and ravine, every unstable cornice and hidden crevasse. She was lighter, more mobile, and driven by a fury they could not comprehend. Most importantly, she had nothing to lose. Wade and David still believed in their own survival. That belief made them cautious. Margaret had already accepted death as a likely outcome. That acceptance made her dangerous. She watched them begin to search, moving upslope in a methodical pattern, checking likely shelter spots. They were still a quarter-mile from the cave entrance, but they were moving in the right direction. If they continued their current trajectory, they would reach her position within 2 hours. She could not allow that. Margaret slithered backward from her observation point and made her way through the snow tunnel into the cave. Her hands shook, not from cold, but from the adrenaline flooding her system. She strapped on the snowshoes she had crafted from bent willow and rawhide, grabbed her knife, and forced herself to think tactically. She needed to lead them away from the cave. More than that, she needed to eliminate the threat they posed. But how does a starving woman with a 4-inch blade defeat 2 armed men? The answer came as she remembered the terrain features she had cataloged during her wood-gathering expeditions. A quarter-mile northeast of the cave, the ridgeline formed a sharp edge where prevailing winds created massive snow cornices, overhanging lips of compacted snow that jutted out over a steep ravine. The drop was approximately 50 feet onto jumbled boulders and frozen scree. The cornices looked stable, solid enough to walk on, but Margaret had learned from old trappers' warnings to never trust them. The slightest additional weight could trigger a collapse, sending tons of snow and ice cascading down in an avalanche that would bury anything below. If she could lure Wade and David onto one of those cornices, the mountain would do the work she could not. Margaret emerged from the cave and deliberately positioned herself on an exposed section of ridge just visible from the valley below. She stood there for a long count of 10, her silhouette dark against the white snow, then dropped flat and began crawling toward the cornice field. Behind her, she heard a shout. Wade had spotted her. A rifle shot cracked across the frozen landscape, the bullet striking limestone 15 feet to her left and spraying chips of stone across the snow. Margaret scrambled to her feet and ran her snowshoes, keeping her on top of the powder where boots would have sunk and trapped her. She ran toward the ridgeline, making sure to leave a clear, chaotic trail that spoke of panic and desperation. Then 50 yards short of the unstable cornice, she veered sharply left and dove into a thick cluster of snow-heavy evergreen branches. She burrowed deep into the tangle, using her knife to cut away inner branches and create a small cavity where she could hide completely concealed by white-covered boughs. From her hiding spot, she had a clear view of the trail she had laid. Now came the waiting. Wade and David crested the ridge 8 minutes later, breathing hard, rifles at the ready. Margaret could see their faces clearly, now could read the mixture of shock and calculation in Wade's expression as he studied the footprints. "Told you, the bitch is alive." Wade's voice carried a note of savage satisfaction. "And she's running scared. Look at this trail," she's panicked. David seemed less certain, his eyes scanning the terrain with growing unease. "Wade, this doesn't feel right. Why would she expose herself like that? Why run this direction? There's nothing up here but cliff edges and that ravine." Wade was already moving forward, following the tracks with predatory focus. "She's starving and half crazy with cold. Probably doesn't even know where she's running. Come on, we can end this right now." They moved along the trail, their boots breaking through the crust, where Margaret's snowshoes had not. They were heavier, slower, and utterly focused on the footprints leading toward the ridge. Neither man noticed the subtle changes in the snow's texture as they approached the cornice, the way the surface took on a slightly different appearance, smoother and more uniform than the surrounding terrain. They certainly did not hear the faint creaking sound as their combined weight began to stress the unstable structure. Margaret held her breath, every muscle locked rigid. 20 feet, 15, 10. Wade was fully onto the cornice now, David just behind him. They were following her tracks precisely, and those tracks led directly onto the weakest section of the overhang. For a moment, nothing happened. Wade took another step, then another. Margaret felt a flash of desperate fear that she had miscalculated, that the cornice would hold, that they would reach the end of the trail and realize the deception. But mountains operate on their own timescale, and physics is patient. The crack when it came was not loud, just a sound like someone breaking a thick branch, a sharp snap that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Wade's eyes went wide as he felt the snow shift beneath his feet. He tried to lunge backward, his arms windmilling for balance, but the entire section of cornice was already separating from the ridge, a massive slab of compacted snow, perhaps 40 feet wide and 20 feet deep. David screamed as the ground simply vanished. The sound was high and terrible, full of the sudden knowledge that death had arrived without warning. Both men dropped straight down as the cornice collapsed, tons of snow following them into the ravine. The avalanche buried everything in seconds, a thunderous cascade that raised a plume of white powder 50 feet into the air. Then silence returned, absolute and final. Margaret waited a full hour before emerging from her hiding place. She approached the edge of the ravine with extreme caution, testing each step, making sure she stayed well clear of any remaining unstable snow. When she finally looked down into the jumble of boulders and ice below, she saw the devastation. David Harrison lay crumpled against a boulder, his neck bent at an angle that made further examination unnecessary. He had died on impact, probably without feeling pain. A small mercy in a situation devoid of mercy. Wade Collier had not been so fortunate. He was pinned from the waist down beneath a slab of compressed ice and snow the size of a wagon. His face, turned upward toward the ridge, was already pale with shock and blood loss. As Margaret watched, his eyes found her silhouette against the sky. Recognition and terror flooded his features in equal measure. She found a safe route down into the ravine, picking her way carefully over the unstable debris field. When she reached Wade, he was still alive, though his breathing came in shallow, bubbling gasps that suggested internal bleeding. His rifle lay 10 feet away undamaged. His pack, torn partially open by the fall, had spilled rations and ammunition across the snow. Wade's mouth worked trying to form words through lips already turning blue. "Margaret, please, in the name of God, help me." Margaret stood over the man who had marched her to her death sentence 3 months ago, who had smiled while denying her a coat and a rifle, who had warned her not to return under threat of being shot. She looked at him with eyes that held nothing human, just a cold assessment of resources and threats. "You cast me out, Wade. You said God would watch over my soul." Her voice, unused for weeks, except to talk to ghosts, came out as a rasp. "The mountain has made its judgment. It seems God favors the widow." Wade's eyes widened in desperate understanding. "Don't. Please. I was following orders. Silas made us. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." Margaret did not respond. She walked past him to retrieve the rifle, a beautiful Winchester with a scope worth more than everything she had owned at Salvation Ridge. She methodically collected the ammunition from his pack, the field rations, the thermos of coffee that was still faintly warm. Wade had a heavy winter coat lined with wool, far superior to Thomas's canvas jacket. She took that too, stripping it from his upper body while he whimpered protests. "You can't leave me. I'll freeze. Please." Margaret paused, the coat in her arms, and looked back at the man who had destroyed her life on another man's orders. For a moment, something flickered in her chest, some remnant of the woman who had taken oaths to heal. Then she remembered Sarah Mitchell's face turning away. She remembered Thomas's body with those terrible bruises. She remembered 3 months of starvation and cold and desperate solitude. "Winter is merciless, Wade. You told me that yourself. Try to stay warm." She climbed out of the ravine, carrying everything of value the two men had brought. She did not look back. Behind her, Wade's shouts turned to screams, then to sobbing pleas, then finally to silence as the temperature dropped and the sun sank toward the western peaks. By nightfall, the temperature would reach 20 below zero. No one pinned and bleeding survived that. Margaret returned to Whispering Hollow with her arms full of stolen life. The dried beef in Wade's pack represented 2 weeks of solid protein. The ammunition meant she could hunt deer successfully, could range farther from the cave without fear of grizzlies or wolves. The rifle itself was a masterpiece of American craftsmanship, perfectly balanced and deadly accurate. Most importantly, the coffee was still warm, and she drank it slowly by the fire, savoring each sip like sacrament. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in months, her body finally releasing the constant tension of near-death survival. When she woke, she felt something that had been absent since October: hope. Not hope for rescue or salvation, but hope that she might actually survive until spring. Hope that she might return to Salvation Ridge with strength rather than as a ghost. Hope that Silas Hackett would face justice. The weeks following Wade and David's deaths marked a transformation in Margaret's circumstances. With the rifle, she hunted, successfully taking down a mule deer buck in early February. The animal provided over 100 pounds of meat and fat, more food than she had possessed since her eviction. She processed the carcass with the efficiency learned from field hospital work, wasting nothing. The hide became additional insulation for the cave floor. The sinew became cord for repairs. The bones cracked and boiled, yielded marrow and broth that restored strength to her wasted frame. Her body began to recover. The relentless weight loss slowed, then stopped, then reversed as the regular protein intake allowed her muscles to rebuild. Her mind, freed from the constant fog of malnutrition, sharpened. She spent her days in purposeful activity, hunting, maintaining the fire, processing food, and most importantly, planning. Thomas's journal had become her scripture. She read it every evening, memorizing not just the location of the silver vein, but the details of Silas's conspiracy, the names of the mining company representatives from Helena, the dates of their visits to Salvation Ridge, the amounts of money discussed. Thomas had documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who understood he was creating evidence for a crime that might not be prosecuted until after his death. Margaret added her own entries to the journal, now writing in the margins with a pencil she had found in Wade's pack. She documented her eviction with precise detail, the names of everyone present, their silence, Sarah Mitchell's betrayal. She wrote about finding Thomas's cache, about the winter of survival, about Wade and David's hunting expedition, and their deaths. She was creating a record, a testimony that would survive even if she did not. But increasingly, she believed she would survive. The worst of winter had passed. The blizzards that came in late February and early March were fierce but brief, nothing compared to December's sustained assault. The days grew incrementally longer. The temperature still dropped below zero most nights, but the highs now reached into the 20s and occasionally the 30s. Spring was coming, distant but inevitable. Margaret used the time to train. She practiced with the rifle until she could hit a mark the size of a man's chest at 200 yards. She climbed the surrounding peaks to rebuild her stamina, pushing herself until her lungs burned and her legs trembled. She was preparing for war, and war required a soldier's conditioning. On March 15th, during a warm spell that brought the temperature above freezing for 3 consecutive days, Margaret experienced her first moment of something approximating peace. She sat outside the cave entrance, the sun warm on her face, and watched a pair of ravens circle overhead. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing patches of dark earth. The sound of water running beneath ice created a constant background music. Spring was arriving, and with it came the end of her exile. She thought about Thomas in those moments, not with the raw grief that had consumed her in November, but with a bittersweet ache of memory. They had been happy together in their simple way. They had built something good, or tried to. That Silas Hackett had destroyed it for money seemed almost incomprehensible in the warm sunlight, an evil so banal it defied understanding. But evil it was, and evil demanded response. Margaret cleaned the rifle and counted her ammunition. 27 rounds, more than enough. She inventoried her supplies, her health, her readiness. The woman who had been cast out in October, terrified and grieving and unprepared, no longer existed. In her place stood something harder, something forged in ice and solitude and righteous fury. Silas Hackett had tried to kill her with winter. Instead, winter had transformed her into exactly the weapon needed to destroy him. On April 10th, with the snow reduced to scattered patches and the trails finally passable, Margaret Brennan packed Thomas's journal, the rifle ammunition, and 2 days' worth of dried venison into Wade's pack. She took one last look at Whispering Hollow, the cave that had been her fortress and her prison, the place where one version of herself had died so another could be born. Then she turned her face toward Salvation Ridge and began the long walk home. The journey took 2 days. The terrain, buried under snow for months, revealed itself in unfamiliar configurations. Streams ran where none had existed before, fed by snowmelt. Deadfall trees blocked trails, forcing detours. But Margaret moved with purpose, covering 20 miles the first day, another 15, the second, her body stronger now than it had been even before her eviction. On the morning of April 13th, she stood on a ridge overlooking Salvation Ridge. The settlement looked exactly as she remembered it. 47 crude cabins, arranged in a loose grid, fields being prepared for spring planting, smoke rising from breakfast fires. People moved between buildings, going about their lives, utterly unaware that a ghost was about to walk among them. Margaret checked the rifle one final time. She chambered around the metallic click, satisfying and final. Then she walked down the ridge toward the settlement, her steps steady, her purpose absolute. She did not hurry. She was expected, though they did not know it yet. The dead do not rush their resurrections. The first person to see her was a child, a young boy hauling water from the communal well. He froze mid-step, the bucket dropping from his hands and spilling across the mud. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Then he turned and ran screaming for his mother. Within seconds, people began emerging from cabins drawn by the commotion. Their faces cycled through shock, disbelief, and fear as they registered what they were seeing. Margaret Brennan, who they had condemned to death 5 months ago, walked through their settlement with a rifle on her shoulder and something in her eyes that made grown men step back. Whispers spread like fire through dry grass. It's her. She's alive. How is she alive? God have mercy, she's alive. She walked past Sarah Mitchell, who stood frozen in the doorway of her cabin, one hand pressed to her mouth. Sarah's face had gone white as bone. Margaret did not spare her a glance. Some betrayals earned acknowledgement. Others did not merit even contempt. The community's meeting house stood at the settlement's center, a large log structure with a crude steeple. Sunday services would be underway. Silas Hackett's voice carrying through the open windows as he preached to his flock. Margaret walked up the steps, kicked open the double doors, and stepped inside. The room fell silent, as if every person had simultaneously stopped breathing. Silas stood at the pulpit, his mouth frozen mid-sermon, his pale eyes locked on the apparition in the doorway. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone near the back began to sob, the sound high and broken. Margaret walked down the center aisle, her boots leaving mud prints on the rough wooden floor. Men began to rise from the pews, hands moving toward weapons that were not there because this was church. This was supposed to be sacred ground. The metallic sound of the rifle being chambered stopped them cold. Every man in the room recognized that sound and understood its promise. Silas found his voice, though it came out higher than usual, strained. Margaret, this is a miracle. God has delivered you back to us. We thought you lost. She stopped 10 feet from the pulpit, the rifle held loosely but ready. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room, flat and cold and absolutely certain. This is not a miracle, Silas. Miracles are gifts from God. I survived through spite. The silence in the meeting house stretched until it became unbearable. A physical pressure that made people shift in the pews and clear their throats nervously. Silas's hands gripped the pulpit hard enough that his knuckles went white, his face cycling through shock towards something more calculated. He was trying to regain control, to find the words that would reassert his authority over the room. Margaret did not give him the chance. 4 months ago, you stood on my porch and told me my husband died in a logging accident. You invoked your charter and cast me into the wilderness to die. You took everything I own. You sent me out with nothing, knowing winter would kill what you did not have the courage to murder directly. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. People exchanged glances, uncertainty blooming where there had been only acceptance of the official narrative. Silas raised one hand in a calming gesture, his voice taking on the soothing tone he used for difficult sermons. Sister Margaret, you are clearly suffering from the ordeal you have endured. The wilderness can break the mind as easily as the body. We enforced the charter as written, as voted by the council. Your husband's debts were substantial. The decision was legal and necessary for the community's survival. Margaret pulled Thomas's journal from her coat and held it up for everyone to see. The leather binding, worn and stained from months in the cave, somehow carried more authority than any Bible. Thomas did not die in an accident. He was murdered. Murdered by you, Silas Hackett, for what he found beneath our land. The murmurs became gasps. Silas's face flushed red, genuine anger or genuine fear, impossible to tell which. This is madness. This is blasphemy. She has been driven insane by isolation. Someone restrain her before she hurts herself or others. 3 men rose from the front pew, moving toward Margaret with the cautious approach of people cornering a dangerous animal. She swung the rifle to her shoulder in one fluid motion, the barrel tracking across all 3. They froze mid-step. Margaret's finger rested lightly on the trigger, and everyone in the room understood that she knew how to use the weapon. Months of hunting for survival had taught lessons that showed in the steadiness of her aim. Sit down, all of you. Nobody moves until I'm finished talking. The 3 men sank back into their seats. The room had gone absolutely still. Every eye locked on the gaunt woman with the rifle and the fury burning in her hollow eyes. She had their attention now, complete and total. Time to use it. Thomas Brennan was a geologist. Some of you knew that. What you did not know was that he spent the last year surveying our homestead and the surrounding ridges. He found something, a silver vein running through the North Ridge, 8 feet thick, 97% Shakespeare, worth millions of dollars. She opened the journal to a page filled with Thomas's neat handwriting and chemical formulas. She held it up so the people in the front rows could see it was real documented, not the ravings of a mind broken by cold. Thomas essayed the samples himself. He documented everything. The location, the purity, the commercial value, and he documented something else. Margaret turned pages until she found what she wanted. Her voice when she read carried the flat precision of courtroom testimony. September 1st, 1978. Silas Hackett discovered me taking core samples from the North Ridge today. I attempted to deflect his questions, but he is not stupid. He saw the vein. He demanded I show him the exact location. I refused. He smiled, then a smile I have never seen from him before. Cold, calculating. He told me the land belongs to Gishet and God's servants. He said we needed to discuss a fair arrangement. He wants me to meet him at the timber mill tomorrow to work out terms. She flipped forward, her finger marking the spot. September 2nd. Did not go to the meeting. Silas sent Wade to find me. Wade was insistent, almost threatening. I agreed to meet with Silas tomorrow morning. I do not trust this situation. I am leaving documentation in a safe location in case something happens. One more page. The final entry. Margaret's voice remained steady, but her eyes burned with cold fire. October 1st. Meeting with Silas at the timber mill at dawn. He claims he has found a buyer willing to form a partnership that we can all profit from the discovery. I do not believe him. I will bring my rifle. Margaret, if you are reading this, I did not come home. It was not an accident. Do not trust Silas Hackett. She closed the journal and let her words settle into the shocked silence. Sarah Mitchell was weeping openly now, her hands covering her face. John Mitchell sat rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. Other faces showed varying degrees of horror, doubt, and dawning comprehension. Silas had recovered his composure, or was performing composure, with desperate skill. His voice rang out with practiced authority, the voice of a man who had commanded this flock for 6 years and did not intend to lose them now. This proves nothing. A dead man's paranoid fantasies filtered through the deranged interpretations of his grief-mad widow. Thomas Brennan died in a logging accident. The county coroner confirmed it. There is no silver. There is no conspiracy. There is only a broken woman who cannot accept that her husband made a fatal mistake. Margaret smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Then you will have no objection to the community searching your private cabin. Because if there is no silver, you will have no assay samples hidden beneath your floorboards. You will have no cash payments from mining companies in Helena. You will have no contracts to sell land that belongs to 47 families who thought they were building a Christian community, not laboring for free while you got rich. The color drained from Silas's face so quickly he might have been bleeding out. That reaction told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. Guilty men do not go pale at the suggestion of innocent searches. Several people rose from their seats, moving not toward Margaret, but toward the door. Silas's voice cracked as he shouted after them, "You will not enter my private home. I am your spiritual leader. You have no right." John Mitchell, who had been silent until now, stood up. His voice carried the weight of a man who had been patient too long. You gave up spiritual authority the moment you started hiding financial dealings from your congregation. Margaret, do you know where Silas keeps his cabin? 3rd row eastern edge, the one with the stone chimney. John looked at the men around him. Men who had worked themselves to exhaustion, believing in a holy mission. Men who were beginning to understand they had been used. Let's go see what our reverend has been hiding. Silas lunged for something beneath the pulpit, his hand emerging with a revolver that must have been stashed there for exactly this kind of emergency. He was bringing it up to aim when Margaret fired. She did not aim for Silas himself, not yet, but for the massive wooden crucifix mounted on the wall, exactly 2 inches from his right ear. The rifle shot in the enclosed space was deafening, a physical assault that left ears ringing and people screaming. The bullet shattered the crucifix into splinters that rained down on Silas as he collapsed backward in shock, the revolver clattering from his hand. Margaret worked the bolt chambering another round and lowered the barrel to point directly at Silas's chest. He lay sprawled on the floor behind the pulpit, his face white with terror. All pretense of authority evaporated. "Don't move, Silas. I spent 5 months learning to shoot. I do not miss anymore." She turned her attention back to the congregation without taking her aim off the fallen preacher. The journal contains maps showing the exact coordinates of the silver vein. It contains copies of chemical assays proving the ore's purity. It contains names and dates of meetings with buyers. Everything you need to understand what happened. Read it, then go search his cabin. I think you will find this story extends beyond my husband's murder. John Mitchell was already moving half a dozen men following him. They pushed out of the meeting house with purpose, their shock transforming into anger. Sarah remained in her seat, crying, her whole body shaking. Margaret met her eyes across the room, and Sarah flinched from what she saw there. Some friendships once broken cannot be repaired. The woman who had turned away when Margaret needed her most did not deserve forgiveness, and Margaret had none to offer. The remaining congregation sat in stunned tableau, nobody quite sure what to do. Margaret kept the rifle trained on Silas, who had not moved from where he had fallen. His lips moved in what might have been prayer, or might have been calculation, trying to find some way out of the trap closing around him. There was no way out. The trap had been set 5 months ago when he chose murder over partnership, and every decision since had only tightened the jaws. Time passed in strange suspension. Minutes felt like hours. Then the meeting house door banged open, and John Mitchell returned, his face flushed with rage, his arms full of evidence. He carried a wooden box that clinked with the sound of ore samples, a metal strong box that surely contained documents, and a leather satchel bulging with what could only be cash. He dumped it all on the floor in front of the first pew, contents spilling across the wood in damning display. Chunks of silvery ore, their surfaces gleaming even in the dim light filtering through the windows. Stacks of bills bound with string, easily $8,000 or $9,000. And papers contracts with a mining company out of Helena, agreements to sell 500 acres of land that included the homesteads of a dozen families who thought they owned their plots outright. Everything dated, everything signed in Silas Hackett's distinctive hand. John's voice shook with barely controlled fury. "It's all here. Every word she spoke was true. He's been planning to sell us out since before Thomas died. The contracts give the mining company full access to the land and mineral rights. We would have been evicted from our own homes and left with nothing." The congregation erupted. People shouted, some in anger, some in denial, some simply overwhelmed by the betrayal. A man in the back demanded to see the contracts. A woman near the front began screaming at Silas, calling him Judas, calling him worse. The careful order of the community was fragmenting in real time, 6 years of manipulation and control unraveling, as people understood how completely they had been used. Silas tried to speak, his voice desperate and pleading. "You do not understand. The money was for all of us. I was negotiating the best deal, building our future. Thomas was going to ruin everything with his demands for control. I had to protect the community." "You killed him!" The shout came from Sarah Mitchell, who had risen from her seat, her tear-stained face contorted with grief and rage. "You killed Thomas, and you tried to kill Margaret, and you did it for money. Where is Wade? Where is David? What happened to them?" Margaret answered before Silas could manufacture another lie. "Wade Collier and David Harrison came hunting for me in January. They were searching for Thomas's documentation and for my body. They found neither. The mountain killed them instead." Gasps and cries met this pronouncement. David Harrison's mother collapsed in her pew sobbing. Several people turned accusatory eyes on Silas, adding 2 more deaths to his ledger. The Reverend seemed to shrink, his grandiose self-image crumbling under the weight of consequences finally arrived. John Mitchell pulled Silas to his feet with rough hands. "We're locking him in the root cellar until the authorities arrive. Does anyone object?" No one did. The community that had followed Silas Hackett with religious devotion now watched in silence as he was dragged from the meeting house, his protests and pleas falling on ears that had finally heard enough lies. Margaret lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly enormous now that the immediate crisis had passed. Her body shook with exhaustion and the adrenaline crash that follows mortal danger. She had done what she came to do. The truth was out. Justice would follow. Sarah approached hesitantly, her steps small and uncertain. "Margaret, I am so sorry. I should have spoken up. I should have helped you. I was frightened of Silas, of what he might do to John, to our family. It is no excuse, but please know I have thought of you every day, prayed for you." Margaret looked at the woman who had once been her closest friend, who had turned away when it mattered most. The anger that had sustained her through 5 months of hell wanted to lash out to wound as she had been wounded. But anger was exhausting and Margaret was tired. "Your prayers did not keep me warm, Sarah. The mountain did that. You made your choice in October. Live with it." She turned away, dismissing Sarah more thoroughly than any words could. John Mitchell waited near the door, the journal in his hands, examining the maps and coordinates with the eye of someone who understood what they meant. When Margaret approached, he looked up with something like awe. "This is real. The vein runs directly under what was your homestead claim. Thomas filed the claim properly with the county 3 years ago. The mineral rights belong to his estate, which means they belong to you. This is a fortune, Margaret." She had not allowed herself to think that far ahead, too focused on survival and then revenge to consider what came after. But John was right. Montana law was clear about homestead mineral rights. Thomas had followed every legal requirement. The silver beneath their land belonged to her, now the sole heir to Thomas Brennan's estate. Millions of dollars in ore just waiting to be extracted. Money enough to never worry about warmth or food again. Money enough to rebuild a life. But the money felt distant, abstract. What mattered more was that Silas Hackett would face justice, that Thomas's murder would not go unpunished, that the community would understand what had been done to them. The wealth was secondary to the vindication. "I need you to ride to Missoula," Margaret told John. "Bring the county sheriff in the federal land office. Bring anyone with legal authority. Silas needs to be charged with murder fraud and everything else they can make stick. The contracts need to be voided. The real ownership of the land needs to be established. Can you do that?" John nodded immediately. "I will leave within the hour. It is a hard 40-mile ride, but I can make it before nightfall if I push. The sheriff will come. This is too big to ignore." He paused, then added more quietly, "What will you do? Will you stay?" Margaret looked around the meeting house at the community that had condemned her to death, at the place where her husband had been eulogized with lies. There was nothing for her here. Whatever Salvation Ridge had been or might have been, it was poison, now haunted by betrayal and murder and the knowledge of what people would do for security and order. "I will stay until the sheriff arrives. After that, I do not know. But I will not live in this place. There are too many ghosts." John left to prepare for his journey. Others approached Margaret, some to apologize, some to ask questions, some simply to stare at the woman who had survived the unsurvivable. She answered when she had energy, ignored them when she did not. Her attention kept drifting to the evidence spread across the floor, the physical proof that her months of suffering had not been madness or paranoia, but response to genuine evil. The wait for John's return with the authorities stretched across 3 days. Margaret stayed in the meeting house rather than accept offers of hospitality from people who had watched her eviction in silence. She slept on the pews, ate food brought by guilt-stricken settlers, and spent the daylight hours organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative for law enforcement. The journal, the ore samples, the contracts, the cash, all of it had to be cataloged and preserved. Silas remained locked in the root cellar, though several people advocated for summary justice, for hanging him from the settlement's main beam and being done with it. Margaret argued against this, not from mercy, but from pragmatism. A lynching would bring federal attention of the wrong kind, might complicate the legal ownership. Questions might taint the evidence. Better to let the law handle it, however slow and imperfect the law might be. Silas would rot in a Montana territorial prison for the rest of his life. That was punishment enough. Wade's and David's bodies were recovered from the ravine on the second day. A search party followed Margaret's directions and found them frozen solid, preserved by the cold. The coroner who examined them ruled the deaths accidental, the result of avalanche and exposure during a winter hunting trip. Margaret did not correct this interpretation. What happened on that ridgeline was between her, the mountain, and God, and she felt no need to share the details with authorities who would not understand. Sheriff Daniel Reeves arrived on the afternoon of the third day, accompanied by a federal land agent and a territorial prosecutor. Margaret had been warned that Reeves was competent but conservative, unlikely to believe a woman's accusations without overwhelming proof. She need not have worried. The evidence spoke for itself. Reeves spent 6 hours examining the journal, the contracts, the ore samples, and interviewing community members. By nightfall, he had arrested Silas Hackett on charges of murder fraud, conspiracy to defraud homesteaders, and half a dozen other violations. Silas was loaded into a wagon bound for Missoula, where he would await trial. As they led him past Margaret, he met her eyes for the first time since his fall from the pulpit. "You have destroyed everything I built, everything this community represented. I hope you are satisfied." Margaret's response was quiet but clear. "You destroyed it yourself the moment you chose murder over honesty. I just made sure people knew." The legal proceedings took months to resolve. Silas Hackett was tried in July 1979 on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Thomas Brennan, and in a surprising prosecutorial addition, Wade Collier, who the prosecutor argued had been sent to his death on Silas's orders. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret testified for an entire day, walking the jury through Thomas's journal, the timeline of his murder, her eviction, and her survival. The defense tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, driven mad by isolation, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. Silas was convicted on both counts and sentenced to 30 years in the territorial prison. The Charter of Salvation Ridge was declared fraudulent, as Silas had lacked proper authority to establish the terms he had enforced. The land was returned to the individual families who had homesteaded it, their claims recognized by the federal government. The mining contracts were voided as signed under false pretenses. The silver vein and the fortune it represented belonged legally to Margaret as Thomas's heir. She did not keep it all. Margaret hired lawyers and structured a deal that gave 40% of the mineral rights to a consortium of the Salvation Ridge families, ensuring they would benefit from the wealth beneath their land. The remaining 60% she sold to a reputable mining company out of Denver for $340,000, an amount that seemed impossible, abstract, more money than she could conceive of spending in 10 lifetimes. With the legal matters resolved, Margaret faced the question that had haunted her since April. What next? She could not stay in Salvation Ridge, renamed Brennan's Hope by the community in Thomas's memory, though the gesture felt hollow and far too late. The land held too many painful associations, too many reminders of what she had lost and could never recover. But she was 34 years old and wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. The future, for the first time in a year, held possibilities. She decided on Seattle. The city was large enough to disappear into, close enough to mountains if she needed them, far enough from Montana to escape the memories. She used part of her settlement to purchase a small veterinary clinic that was struggling financially, the owner eager to retire. Margaret had no formal training in animal medicine, but her nursing background translated surprisingly well, and she hired a licensed veterinarian to handle the complex cases while she managed the business and learned the trade. The work was satisfying in ways she had not anticipated. Animals did not lie. They did not betray. They suffered and healed according to rules that made sense. She threw herself into the clinic with the same intensity she had brought to survival in the cave, rebuilding herself through purposeful labor. Sarah Mitchell wrote letters for the first 3 years, long, rambling apologies that tried to explain her silence, her fear, her weakness. Margaret read the first few, then stopped opening them. Some betrayals could not be forgiven, not because the betrayer was unworthy of forgiveness, but because the wound was too deep to heal. Eventually, the letter stopped coming. Other members of Brennan's Hope stayed in touch, particularly John Mitchell, who sent periodic updates on the community's progress. The mine had begun in operations in 1981, providing Shrun an income that transformed the settlement from struggling commune to prosperous small town. Schools were built, a proper church one with a minister who had not murdered anyone. Families thrived. The silver that Silas Hackett had killed for became the foundation of something better than he had ever imagined, and he rotted in prison knowing he would never benefit from it. Margaret did not visit. She followed the news from a distance, glad the people had found something good from the ashes of Silas's corruption, but unable to participate personally. Her life was in Seattle now, among people who knew nothing of her history, who saw only a competent businesswoman with a talent for healing animals and a tendency toward privacy. She never remarried. There were offers, occasionally men drawn to her quiet strength and the mystery they sensed beneath her surface. But Margaret had learned in that cave that she was sufficient unto herself, that she needed no one's protection or provision. Companionship was pleasant, but not required. Her life was full enough with work, with the satisfaction of a business well run, with the knowledge that she had survived what was meant to kill her. The dreams came less frequently as years passed. The nightmares of cold and starvation, of Wade's dying pleas, of Thomas's bruised throat, all of them faded to occasional visitations rather than nightly torment. She learned to live with them, to accept that trauma leaves scars even when the wounds heal. Some winters, when the snow fell heavy in Seattle's hills, she would stand at her window and watch it accumulate. And for a moment, she would be back in Whispering Hollow, counting matches by firelight. Then the moment would pass, and she would return to the present, grateful beyond measure for central heating and a full pantry. Margaret Brennan lived another 40 years after that winter, building a quiet life of purpose and competence. She expanded the clinic, trained young veterinarians, became known in Seattle's animal welfare community as someone who could handle the difficult cases no one else wanted. She was respected, occasionally feared, never pitied. She donated anonymously to causes supporting domestic abuse survivors in homeless shelters, understanding viscerally what it meant to be cast out with nothing. When she died in 2019 at the age of 75 peacefully in her sleep after a brief illness, her will revealed she had left the bulk of her estate to establish a scholarship fund for women pursuing veterinary medicine, with preference given to applicants who had overcome significant hardship. The fund was named the Thomas Brennan Memorial Scholarship, ensuring her husband's name would be associated with helping rather than tragedy. Her obituary in the Seattle Times was brief, noting her ownership of the clinic and her philanthropic work, but making no mention of Montana or Salvation Ridge or the winter that had defined her. That part of her life remained private, a story she had never told publicly, preferring to let the court records and the distant legend speak for themselves. But in Brennan's Hope, now a thriving town of 1,500, the news of her passing was received with genuine grief. The people who remembered her firsthand were mostly gone, but the story had been passed down through 2 generations. Children grew up knowing about the widow who survived winter through courage and cunning, who brought down a corrupt reverend and saved the town from exploitation. They knew her as a hero, and they mourned her as one. The town council organized a memorial service in the church that had replaced the old meeting house. Over 200 people attended, filling the pews to capacity. They sang hymns and shared stories, most of them secondhand or embellished, but all of them acknowledging that without Margaret Brennan's refusal to die when she was supposed to, Brennan's Hope would not exist. The silver that funded their schools and hospital and prosperity would have been stolen by Silas Hackett, the families evicted, the community destroyed. At the end of the service, they observed a moment of silence, and in that silence, the wind picked up outside, howling through the mountains the way it did every winter, carrying that specific promise of cold and harshness to come. And in that wind, some of the older attendees swore they could hear it still, the voice of a woman who had learned to speak the mountain's language, who had survived what was meant to kill her, not through divine intervention, but through stubborn, furious, unbreakable will. The winter wind sang through Brennan's hope, and the people listened and they remembered.